The rope burns cut deep into Caleb Brandt's wrists as he watched the woman he'd saved being dragged back to that cursed auction block. "Sign the papers, fat girl, or watch your mountain man swing." The railroad baron's voice echoed across the Colorado town square like a death knell. Ruth Anne Stoultz, once humiliated and broken, now stood defiant, her father's Bible clutched against her chest, her eyes blazing with newfound courage. This is a story of redemption rising from the ashes of shame, where love blooms in the wilderness and faith conquers greed. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale of hope has traveled across the world. The autumn wind of 1882 carried the scent of coming snow down from the Colorado Rockies, but in the dusty streets of Millfield, all anyone could smell was greed. The railroad was coming, and with it, the kind of money that made honest men forget their prayers and cruel men sharpen their knives. Ruth Anne Stoultz stood in the shadows of Gunderson's General Store, her plain brown dress hanging loose on her heavy frame, watching the crowd gather in the town square. At 19, she had the kind of face that might have been pretty if life had been kinder, soft blue eyes that held too much sadness, hair the color of wheat that never saw a proper ribbon, and hands already rough from work that should have belonged to a woman twice her age. "Ruth Ann!" The voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. Her uncle Josiah Stoultz stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, his thin face twisted into its familiar sneer. "Get over here, girl. Time to pay your family's debts." Her stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon ever since her parents died of the fever last spring. But knowing hadn't made her ready. "Uncle Josiah, please," she whispered as she approached, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the growing crowd. "Father left me the farm. I can work it. I can work it." Josiah's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You, a fat, useless girl who can barely tend a garden, that land's worth more than you'll ever be, and the railroad wants it. Since you can't pay the taxes your fool father owed, you'll be sold to cover the debt." The words hit her like physical blows. Around them, the townspeople began to press closer, drawn by the promise of entertainment. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery whispered to her neighbor behind a gloved hand. Young Tom Miller pointed and snickered with his friends. Even Pastor William stood silent, his eyes cast down, unwilling to meet her gaze. Sheriff Briggs, a man whose belly strained against his vest and whose breath always smelled of whiskey, stepped forward with a piece of paper in his hands. "Ruth Anne Stoultz," he announced in a voice that carried across the square, "by order of the county court, you are hereby to be sold into indentured servitude to satisfy the debts of your deceased father's estate, totaling $47.32. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Someone called out, "What's the starting bid, Sheriff?" Another voice shouted, "Who'd want to buy that fat cow?" The laughter that followed felt like acid in Ruth Ann's veins. Her uncle's hand clamped down on her arm like a vice. "Up on the block, girl. Let's see what you're worth." The auction block was nothing more than a wooden platform that the town usually used for speeches and celebrations. Today it felt like a gallows. Ruth Ann's legs shook as she climbed the 3 steps, each one feeling like she was walking deeper into a nightmare. The sheriff grabbed her by the shoulders and turned her to face the crowd. "Here we have Ruth Anne Stoultz," Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice taking on the practiced rhythm of an auctioneer. 19 years old, strong as an ox, good for cooking, cleaning, and farm work. She's got all her teeth and hasn't been touched by any man. I can vouch for that personally." The crowd roared with laughter at the sheriff's crude joke. Ruth Ann felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she forced herself to keep her head up. Her father had always told her that a person's dignity couldn't be taken, only given away. "She's a bit on the heavy side," the sheriff continued, walking around her like she was livestock, "but that just means she won't break under hard work. What am I bid for this fine specimen of womanhood?" Silence. The kind of silence that screamed louder than any words. Ruth Anne looked out over the faces in the crowd, faces she'd known all her life. There was Mary Hutchins, who used to play with her when they were children. There was Mr. Garrett, who always tipped his hat to her after church. There was young Samuel Brooks, who had once asked to walk her home from the harvest dance. Not one of them would meet her eyes. "Come on now," Sheriff Briggs cajoled, his voice growing more desperate. "She's worth at least $10, surely. Look at those arms, she could plow a field by herself." More snickers from the crowd, but still no bids. Ruth Anne felt something inside her chest begin to crack. She had known she wasn't beautiful, had accepted that she would likely never marry, had made peace with a life of spinsterhood and caring for aging relatives. But to stand here displayed like an animal at market and have no one, not one single person, consider her worth even $10. $5, the sheriff tried again, his voice now edged with frustration. $5 for a strong, healthy girl. "I wouldn't pay 50 cents for that barrel of lard," someone called out from the back of the crowd. The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. Ruth Ann's vision blurred, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of them. "All right then," Sheriff Briggs said, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "If nobody wants to bid, she goes to jail until someone will take her. Can't have debtors running around free now, can we?" Uncle Josiah stepped forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "Actually, Sheriff, I believe the law says that if no one bids, the debtor can be disposed of in whatever manner the court sees fit." His smile was like a snake's. "And I hear the railroad is always looking for workers. Dangerous work, but someone's got to do it." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what happened to people who went to work for the railroad's construction crews in the deep mountains. Few came back. Ruth Anne closed her eyes and tried to find her father's voice in her memory. "God has a plan for everyone, little bird," he used to tell her, "even when we can't see it, even when it seems like the whole world's against us. He's got a purpose for our lives." Right now it was hard to believe. "Going once," Sheriff Briggs called out, though no bids had been made. "Going twice. Wait." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, quiet, but carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. Heads turned, and the crowd began to part like the Red Sea. Ruth Anne opened her eyes and gasped. Standing at the back of the square was a man unlike any she'd ever seen. Tall, easily 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His hair was dark as a raven's wing and hung to his shoulders, held back by a strip of leather. His skin was weathered brown by sun and wind, and a scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, giving his face a fierce, dangerous look. But it was his eyes that made Ruth Anne's breath catch. They were the color of winter sky, pale blue, almost gray, and they held a kind of pain that she recognized. This was a man who knew suffering. He wore buckskins instead of proper clothes, and a knife hung at his belt alongside what looked like a tomahawk. Everything about him screamed mountain man, one of those wild, solitary souls who lived in the high country and came to town maybe once a year for supplies. The crowd murmured and whispered as he walked forward. Ruth Anne heard fragments. "That's Caleb Brandt. Killed 3 men with his bare hands. Lives up in the devil's teeth. His wife was an Indian." Caleb Brandt stopped directly in front of the auction block and looked up at Ruth Anne. For a moment their eyes met, and she felt something pass between them, a recognition perhaps, or an understanding. He saw her pain because he carried his own. "I'll bid," he said simply. Sheriff Briggs blinked in surprise. "Well, how much?" Caleb reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a single silver dollar. He placed it on the edge of the platform with a soft clink. $1, he said. The crowd exploded in shocked laughter. $1, someone shouted. "She's not worth even that." The mountain man's gone soft in the head. But Sheriff Briggs was already looking nervous. Everyone knew Caleb Brandt's reputation. He'd fought in the Indian Wars, had lived among the Shoshone, and could track a man across bare rock. More importantly, he was completely unpredictable and had no fear of the law. "Any other bids?" the sheriff called out quickly, clearly hoping someone else would step forward. Silence. Uncle Josiah stepped closer to the platform, his face twisted with rage. "Now see here, Brandt. That girl's got valuable land in her name. The railroad can go to hell," Caleb said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the square. "And so can you, Stoultz." The crowd held its breath. Josiah Stoultz was known to be in the railroad's pocket, and crossing him meant crossing some very powerful men. But Caleb Brandt looked utterly unconcerned. $1 going once," Sheriff Briggs said quickly. "Going twice." He paused, looking around desperately for another bidder. "Sold to Mr. Caleb Brandt for $1. The gavel came down with finality. Ruth Anne felt her knees go weak. She'd been sold, actually sold, like a horse or a cow or a sack of grain. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow, and she swayed on her feet. But then Caleb was there, stepping onto the platform with surprising grace for such a large man. He reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her arm. "Easy," he said softly for her ears alone. "I'm not going to hurt you." She looked into those winter sky eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: kindness. It was buried deep beneath layers of pain and anger and loneliness, but it was there. "Why?" she whispered. His smile was sad and crooked. "Because I know what it's like to be thrown away." Sheriff Briggs thrust a piece of paper at Caleb. "This here's the bill of sale. She's yours now, legal and proper. You can do whatever you want with her." Caleb took the paper without looking at it and tore it in half. Then he tore it again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like snow. The crowd gasped. Uncle Josiah stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "You can't do that. That's a legal document." "Was a legal document," Caleb corrected. "Now it's trash." He turned to Ruth Anne and offered her his hand. "Come on, let's get out of here." She hesitated for just a moment, looking out over the crowd of people who had watched her humiliation without a word of protest. These were her neighbors, her community, the people she'd grown up with, and not one of them had lifted a finger to help her. She took Caleb's hand. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they closed around hers with surprising gentleness. Together they walked down from the platform and through the crowd which parted before them, like they were dangerous animals. As they reached the edge of the square, Uncle Josiah called out after them, "This isn't over, Brandt. The railroad wants that land, and they'll get it one way or another." Caleb stopped and turned around slowly. When he spoke, his voice was soft as silk and twice as deadly. "If I see you anywhere near her again, Stoultz, I'll feed you to the bears piece by piece. And that's not a threat, it's a promise." The color drained from Josiah's face, and he took an involuntary step backward. Caleb turned back to Ruth Anne. "My horse is at the livery. Can you ride?" She nodded, though in truth she'd only ridden the old plow horse a few times. But she would have walked barefoot through hell rather than stay in this town another minute. The livery stable was owned by old Pete, a grizzled man who'd known Ruth Anne since she was born. He looked up as they entered, his rheumy eyes moving from her face to Caleb's and back again. "Heard what happened in the square," he said quietly. "Shame on this whole town." It was the first kind word anyone had spoken to her all day, and Ruth Anne felt her composure begin to crack. "Can I get my horse?" Caleb asked. Pete nodded toward the back stall. "Big black stallion with the white blaze been waiting for you. That's one fine animal." Caleb's horse was indeed magnificent, a powerful black stallion that stood at least 17 hands high. The animal nickered softly when he saw his master and nuzzled Caleb's shoulder. "This is Shadow," Caleb said to Ruth Anne as he saddled the horse with practiced ease. "He's got a gentle mouth despite his size. You'll ride behind me." As he worked, Pete shuffled closer to Ruth Anne. "You sure about this girl?" he asked in a low voice. "Going off with a stranger to God knows where." Ruth Anne looked back toward the stable doors beyond which lay the town that had just watched her soul being sold. "What choice do I have?" Pete nodded sadly. "Reckon you're right, but for what it's worth, I think Brandt's a good man. Rough around the edges, but good. He brought me medicine for my arthritis last winter, didn't ask for nothing in return." A few minutes later, Caleb helped her up onto Shadow's back. His hands were strong but careful, and he made sure she was secure before swinging up in front of her. "Hold on," he said simply. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid strength of him through his buckskin shirt. He smelled of pine needles and wood smoke and something wild and clean that she couldn't identify. As they rode out of Millfield, Ruth Anne looked back one last time at the only home she'd ever known. The crowd in the square was already dispersing, people returning to their daily lives as if nothing had happened. As if a human being hadn't just been sold like livestock in their town square. The mountains rose ahead of them, dark and forbidding against the pale sky. Ruth Anne had never been more than 5 miles from town in her entire life, and now she was riding into the wilderness with a stranger who'd bought her for $1. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. Behind them, Millfield grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vastness of the Colorado Territory. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous, uncertain, but somehow less frightening than the cruelty she was leaving behind. As Shadow's hooves rang against the rocky trail, Ruth Anne closed her eyes and tried to feel her father's presence. "Maybe this is part of your plan," she whispered to the wind. "Maybe this is where the story really begins." The mountain man said nothing, but she felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Mile by mile, they climbed higher into the thin air and the waiting wilderness, 2 broken souls seeking something that neither could name, but both desperately needed. The real journey was just beginning. The trail wound ever upward through stands of aspen and pine, their golden leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Ruth Anne had lost track of time. It could have been hours or days since they'd left Millfield behind. Her body ached from the unfamiliar rhythm of horseback riding, but she didn't dare complain. Every mile that stretched between her and that cursed town square felt like a small victory. Shadow picked his way carefully along the narrow mountain path, his hooves finding purchase on rocks that looked impossible to navigate. Ruth Anne marveled at the sure-footed grace of the great stallion, and at the easy way Caleb sat in the saddle, moving with his horse, as if they were one creature. "How much farther?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Not much," Caleb replied without turning around. "We'll be there before sunset." The sun was already hanging low in the western sky, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Ruth Anne had never seen anything so beautiful, but the approaching darkness filled her with new anxieties. What would happen when they reached wherever they were going? What did this strange man expect from her? The paper might be torn, but she knew the reality. She belonged to him now, whether there was a legal document or not. They crested a ridge, and suddenly the world opened up before them. A valley spread out below, hidden deep in the mountains like a secret. A stream ran through its center, catching the last light of day like liquid silver. And there, nestled against a grove of tall pines, stood a small log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. "Home," Caleb said simply. As they descended into the valley, Ruth Anne saw that the cabin was modest but well built, with a covered porch and what looked like a small barn behind it. A vegetable garden, now brown with autumn, stretched along the southern side, and she could see the glint of a well near the front door. But what struck her most was the silence. After a lifetime in town, surrounded by the constant noise of neighbors and commerce, the mountain quiet felt almost overwhelming. The only sounds were Shadow's hooves on the rocky ground, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the distant murmur of the stream. Caleb brought Shadow to a halt near the cabin and swung down from the saddle with fluid grace. Then he turned and offered his hands to help Ruth Anne dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. Hours of riding had left her muscles stiff and trembling. "You'll get used to it," he said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Takes time to find your mountain legs." She looked up at the cabin, trying to imagine what awaited her inside. The windows glowed warmly with lamplight, and the smell of something cooking drifted from the chimney. It looked like a home, not a prison, but appearances could be deceiving. Caleb seemed to sense her nervousness. "Ruth Anne," he said, and it was the first time he'd spoken her name. It sounded different in his voice, gentler somehow, without the mockery or dismissal she'd grown used to hearing. "I want you to understand something. What happened in town today, that was an abomination. No human being should be bought and sold like livestock." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I don't own you," he continued, his winter blue eyes serious and steady. "Nobody owns you. You're free to leave whenever you want, and I'll help you get wherever you need to go. But if you want to stay, you're welcome here. This valley could use a woman's touch." The words hit her like a physical blow. Free. She'd never been free, not really. From childhood, she'd been bound by expectations and obligations, told what to do and how to behave and what her place in the world should be. The idea of actual freedom was so foreign, it made her dizzy. I don't understand," she whispered. "You paid for me." The sheriff said, "The sheriff's a fool and a drunk." Caleb cut her off. "That $1 wasn't payment for you. It was payment to get you away from that mob before they did something even worse." His jaw tightened. "I've seen what happens when crowds get bloodthirsty. It doesn't end well." He began unsaddling Shadow, his movements quick and efficient. "There's a spare room inside. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can rest, get your bearings, decide what you want to do next." Ruth Anne watched him work, this strange man who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. "Why did you help me?" Caleb paused in his work, his hands stilling on the saddle. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Because 5 years ago I watched the woman I loved die while good people stood by and did nothing." He resumed his work, his movements sharp with old pain. "I swore I'd never stand by again when someone needed help." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Ruth Ann's chest ache. She wanted to ask more, but something in his posture warned her away from the subject. Instead, she followed him as he led Shadow toward the small barn. The barn was neat and well organized, with stalls for 3 horses, though only one was occupied, a gentle-looking mare who nickered softly when she saw them. Hay was stacked in orderly bales, and the smell of clean straw filled the air. "That's Luna," Caleb said, nodding toward the mare as he settled Shadow into the stall next to hers. "She's getting on in years, but she's steady. If you decide to stay, she'll teach you to ride properly." The casual assumption that she might stay, that she might have a future here, sent a flutter of something through Ruth Ann's chest. Hope, maybe, or just the absence of despair. When Shadow was settled and fed, Caleb led her toward the cabin. The porch steps creaked under their feet, and Ruth Anne noticed that the door was carved with intricate patterns, spirals, and animals and symbols she didn't recognize. "Shoshone work," Caleb said, catching her stare. "My wife carved that door, said it would keep evil spirits away." His wife. The Indian woman people had whispered about in town. Ruth Anne wanted to ask what had happened to her, but again, something in Caleb's voice warned her to tread carefully. The inside of the cabin was a revelation. Ruth Anne had expected something rough and primitive, but while the furniture was simple, everything was well made and cared for. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a warm fire crackling behind an iron grate. Thick rugs covered the plank floors, and the walls were lined with shelves, holding books, tools, and various objects that looked like they might have significance she couldn't understand. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, pointing to a doorway. "Your room's upstairs, first door on the left. There's a wash basin and clean linens. Supper'll be ready in an hour or so." Ruth Anne climbed the narrow stairs, her legs still shaky from the long ride. The upstairs was divided into 3 small rooms. The first door on the left opened to reveal a modest but comfortable space, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. Clean quilts were folded at the foot of the bed, and a ceramic pitcher and basin sat on the dresser. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser and winced. Her hair had come loose from its braid during the ride, her dress was wrinkled and dusty, and her face bore the tracks of tears she didn't remember shedding. She looked like exactly what she was, a broken woman with nowhere left to go. But as she washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher, she began to feel marginally human again. The simple act of making herself presentable was oddly comforting, a small assertion of dignity in a world that had tried to strip it away. When she came back downstairs, the smell of cooking food made her stomach growl loudly. She realized she hadn't eaten anything since the previous evening. The morning's events had driven all thought of food from her mind. Caleb was in the kitchen stirring something in a large pot over the wood stove. He'd changed from his travel clothes into a clean shirt and pants, and had tied his long hair back with a leather cord. Without the dangerous mountain man appearance, he looked younger, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "Venison stew," he said without looking up, "and biscuits, nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up." The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a good-sized table, well-stocked shelves, and modern conveniences that surprised her. A hand pump brought water directly to the sink, and the stove was a fine cast-iron model that wouldn't have looked out of place in any town kitchen. "This is beautiful," she said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the wooden table. "Did you build all this yourself?" "Most of it." He ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table along with a plate of golden biscuits. "Had help with some of the heavier work. The Shoshone have a settlement about a day's ride north. Good people. They taught me a lot about living in these mountains." They ate in companionable silence for a while. The stew was delicious, rich and hearty, with vegetables she recognized from her own garden back home. The biscuits were better than any she'd ever made, light and flaky and perfectly browned. "This is wonderful," she said finally. "You're a good cook." Caleb's smile was rueful. "I had to learn. It was either that or starve." He paused, then added, "Sarah, my wife, she tried to teach me, but I was too proud to listen. Thought cooking was women's work. After she died, I nearly did starve before I swallowed my pride and learned to fend for myself." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name, and Ruth Anne could hear the pain in his voice. "How long ago did she die?" 3 years. He stared into his bowl as if seeing something there that she couldn't. "Fever took her. Same kind that killed your parents, probably. I rode for the doctor, but by the time I got back..." He shrugged, but the gesture was heavy with old grief. "I'm sorry," Ruth Anne said softly. "She must have been very special." She was. Caleb pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out into the gathering darkness. Found her half dead from exposure when she was 16. Her family had been killed by soldiers, and she'd been wandering in the snow for days. Nursed her back to health and, well, she decided to stay. Ruth Anne tried to imagine this hard, dangerous man caring for a sick girl, and found that she could. There was gentleness in him, carefully hidden, but unmistakably there. What was she like? Caleb was quiet for so long that Ruth Anne thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, lost in memory. Brave, stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. She could track a deer through 3 miles of forest and never lose the trail, could speak to horses like they were people. A smile ghosted across his lips, and she could make the most beautiful things with her hands. Beadwork pottery quilts that looked like they were made of sunlight and dreams. He turned back to Ruth Anne, and she was struck by the raw loneliness in his eyes. She wanted children. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be, I guess. She said the spirits would send us the right child when the time came. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Ruth Anne sensed that she was treading on sacred ground, memories too precious and painful to be shared with a stranger. But before she could change the subject, Caleb spoke again. "She would have liked you," he said simply. Sarah had a soft spot for anyone who'd been hurt by the world. She would have taken one look at what happened in that town square and declared holy war on the whole place. The words warmed something inside Ruth Ann's chest, but they also brought a fresh wave of uncertainty. "Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, his expression serious. "What do you expect from me? I mean, if I stay here, what would my place be? What would you want me to do?" It was a fair question, and she could see him thinking it through carefully before answering. "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "If you want to stay, you'd be welcome to contribute however you see fit. This place needs work, the garden needs tending, the cabin could use a woman's touch, and I'll admit I'm not much of a housekeeper. But those would be things you chose to do, not things I demanded. And if I can't earn my keep, if I'm just a burden..." Caleb's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but she sensed it wasn't directed at her. "Ruth Anne, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not a burden. You are not worthless. You are not any of the things those people in town made you feel. You're a human being with dignity and worth, and anyone who can't see, that is blind." The conviction in his voice brought tears to her eyes. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her like that? When was the last time anyone had seen value in her simply for being herself? "I don't know how to be free," she whispered. I've always been told what to do, how to be, what was expected of me. I don't know how to make my own choices." "Then you'll learn," Caleb said gently. "It takes practice like anything else. Start small. Decide what you want for breakfast tomorrow. Choose what book you want to read from the shelf. Pick which chores you feel like doing. Build up to the bigger decisions." He returned to the table and sat down across from her. "But Ruth Anne, I want you to understand something. You don't have to decide tonight or tomorrow or even next week. Winter's coming, and these mountains aren't forgiving to travelers once the snow starts. You'll stay here until spring at least, whether you want to or not. That gives you time to figure things out." The practical consideration of survival made the decision easier somehow. She wasn't choosing to stay with him, she was simply accepting the reality of mountain weather. It was a distinction that made her feel less owned. "All right," she said. "I'll stay through the winter, and I'll try to be useful." "You'll be more than useful," Caleb said. "You'll be..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Company. It gets lonely up here. I'd forgotten how much I missed having someone to talk to." Over the next few days, Ruth Anne began to settle into a routine. She woke each morning to the sound of Caleb chopping wood or tending to the horses, and by the time she dressed and came downstairs, he'd usually have coffee ready and the fire built up. They'd eat breakfast together sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes talking about small things like the weather or what needed doing that day. The work came naturally to her. Years of caring for her parents' household had taught her how to cook clean and manage a home efficiently. But here, for the first time, she felt appreciated for her efforts. When she baked bread, Caleb praised its lightness. When she mended a tear in her arm on his shirt, he thanked her gravely. When she reorganized the pantry, he told her she had a gift for making chaos into order. The small kindnesses meant more to her than he could possibly know. She also began to explore the valley at first, staying close to the cabin but gradually venturing farther as her confidence grew. The place was beautiful beyond description. Hidden meadows filled with wildflowers, crystal-clear pools fed by mountain springs, and stands of aspen that shimmered gold in the autumn light. Sarah used to say this valley was sacred, Caleb told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The Shoshone have stories about it going back generations. They say it's a place where broken spirits come to heal. Ruth Anne could believe it. There was something about the place that soothed her wounded soul, a peace that seemed to seep into her bones with each passing day. But peace was a fragile thing, and she knew their sanctuary wouldn't remain hidden forever. On a crisp morning in early October, that fragility was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Caleb was instantly alert, his hand moving to the rifle that was never far from his side. "Stay inside," he told Ruth Anne tersely. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Through the kitchen window she watched as 3 men rode into the clearing. Her blood turned to ice when she recognized the lead rider, her uncle Josiah, his thin face twisted with its familiar sneer. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't know, both wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as railroad men. "Brandt," Josiah called out as he dismounted, "I know you're in there, and I know you've got the girl. Time to discuss business like civilized men." Caleb stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Nothing civilized about you, Stoultz. I told you what would happen if I saw you again." Now, Josiah said, his voice taking on a false reasonableness. "No need for threats. I've got a proposition that'll benefit everyone." He gestured to the 2 men behind him. "These gentlemen represent the Colorado Central Railroad. They're prepared to make a very generous offer for the Stoultz family land." "The girl doesn't own any land," Caleb said flatly. "You saw to that when you had her sold for debts." One of the railroad men stepped forward, a well-dressed man with a carefully waxed mustache and cold, calculating eyes. "Actually, Mr. Brandt, there seems to have been a legal error. Miss Stoultz's father left the land to her in his will, but there's a technicality in how the debt was handled. If she's willing to sign the land over to us, we'll pay off the debt and give her a substantial sum besides. Everyone wins." Ruth Anne felt her hands begin to shake. Even hidden away in this mountain paradise, her past had found her. The railroad wanted her family's land, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. "What if she doesn't want to sell?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The railroad man's smile was as cold as a winter morning. "Well, then I'm afraid the debt stands, and debts have a way of accumulating interest. By my calculations, she now owes nearly $200. That's a hanging offense in Colorado territory." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Ruth Anne knew they weren't bluffing. The railroad had enough money and influence to twist the law however they needed it twisted. "Of course," the man continued, "if she were to sign the papers, all would be forgiven. She'd be free to go wherever she pleased with money in her pocket. It's really quite generous of us. And if she refuses," the man's smile never wavered, "then I'm afraid we'd have to involve the authorities. Sheriff Briggs is very concerned about the irregularities in her debt situation. He's already prepared a warrant for her arrest." Caleb's knuckles went white on his rifle. "You son of a—" Now, Josiah interrupted, his voice oily with false concern. "No need for unpleasantness. Why don't you just bring the girl out here and let her decide for herself? I'm sure she'll see reason." From her hiding place in the kitchen, Ruth Anne closed her eyes and tried to think. Her father's land, the place where she'd been born, where her parents were buried, where she'd planned to live out her days. It wasn't much, just a small farm in a valley that would soon be bisected by railroad tracks. But it was hers, the only thing of value she'd ever owned. The railroad men were right about one thing: they could make her life hell if she refused. They had the law on their side and enough money to buy whatever justice they needed. If she didn't sign, she'd spend her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the sheriff to come with chains. But if she did sign, she thought about the way the townspeople had watched her humiliation without lifting a finger to help. She thought about her uncle's greedy eyes and the railroad men's cold calculation. She thought about her father, who'd worked himself into an early grave trying to scratch a living from that rocky soil. And she thought about Caleb standing on the porch with his rifle ready, prepared to fight impossible odds to protect her. For the first time in her life, Ruth Anne Stoultz got angry. She walked to the front door and stepped onto the porch beside Caleb. His head snapped around in surprise, but she was already speaking. "Uncle Josiah," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "You're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave." Josiah's face lit up with triumph. "Ruth Anne, there's my sensible niece. Now these gentlemen have a very reasonable offer." "I heard the offer," she cut him off. "And my answer is no." The railroad man's expression hardened. "Miss Stoultz, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. You're facing serious criminal charges." "For what?" Ruth Anne demanded. "For being poor, for having a father who died before he could pay taxes on land that's been in our family for 10 years, for being sold like livestock to pay debts. I never owed. Now see here. No, you see here." Ruth Anne stepped forward, and something in her voice made all three men take an involuntary step back. "That land was bought with my father's sweat and paid for with my mother's tears. Every rock, every tree, every blade of grass has our blood in it, and you think you can steal it with legal tricks and threats?" Caleb was staring at her with something that might have been admiration. The quiet, broken girl from the auction block was gone, replaced by a woman with fire in her eyes and iron in her spine. "The debt you're talking about is show me the papers," Ruth Anne continued. "Show me exactly what my father supposedly owed and to whom. Show me the legal documents that gave you the right to sell me like a slave. Show me the law that says a man's daughter has to pay for his mistakes with her freedom." The railroad man's smile faltered slightly. "Miss Stoultz, legal technicalities aside—" "There are no technicalities," Ruth Anne said firmly. "There's right and there's wrong, and what you're doing is wrong." Uncle Josiah pushed forward, his face red with anger. "You ungrateful little bitch! I could have left you to rot in that jail, but instead I'm trying to help you." The words died in his throat as Caleb's rifle swung toward him with deadly precision. "You'll watch your tongue when you speak to the lady," Caleb said quietly, "or I'll cut it out and feed it to the crows." The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. For a moment, Ruth Anne thought violence was inevitable. Then the railroad man cleared his throat and stepped between his companions and the rifle barrel. "Perhaps we should panel this discussion for now," he said carefully. "Give Miss Stoultz time to consider our generous offer, but I should mention that our patience isn't unlimited. Winter's coming, and these mountains can be very dangerous for people who don't have the railroad's protection." Another threat, this one barely veiled. Ruth Anne felt Caleb tense beside her, but she put a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. she said to the railroad man. "Morrison, James Morrison, Vice President of Land Acquisition for Colorado Central." "Well, Mr. Morrison, I've considered your offer, and my answer is still no. My land is not for sale at any price, and if anything happens to me or Mr. Brandt, I've already made arrangements for certain information to reach the territorial governor's office. Information about bribery, illegal land seizures, and human trafficking." It was a complete bluff. She'd made no such arrangements, but Morrison's face went pale. The railroad might own local sheriffs and judges, but the territorial government was a different matter entirely. "That sounds suspiciously like a threat, Miss Stoultz," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "Not a threat," Ruth Anne replied sweetly. "A promise, just like the one Mr. Brandt made to my uncle about feeding him to the bears." Morrison's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he turned and stalked back to his horse. "This isn't over," he called as he mounted. "The railroad gets what it wants, one way or another." "Not this time," Ruth Anne called back. "Not from me." The three men rode out of the valley at a gallop, leaving nothing behind but dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Ruth Anne stood on the porch until they disappeared from sight. Then suddenly her knees gave out and she sank onto the steps. "Ruth Anne!" Caleb was beside her instantly, his strong hands steadying her. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since her parents died, she felt something that might have been pride. "I stood up to them," she whispered. "I actually stood up to them." "You did more than that," Caleb said, and his voice was filled with something that sounded like awe. "You faced down 3 armed men and made them back down with nothing but words and courage. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Ruth Anne felt tears on her cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of shame or sorrow. Do you think they'll come back? Caleb's expression grew grim. Count on it. Men like that don't give up easy, especially when there's money involved. But we'll be ready for them. We. He'd said we as if they were partners in this fight, as if her battles were his battles now. Caleb, she said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you willing to fight the railroad for me, even though it might cost you everything? He was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and new resolve. 3 years ago, I watched good men stand by while my wife died because she was Indian and they didn't think her life mattered. I swore I'd never let that happen again. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Besides, Sarah always said this valley would call to the people who needed it most. Maybe it called to you for a reason. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Ruth Anne felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in her fight. For the first time, someone was willing to stand beside her and face whatever came. The railroad might have money and influence and the law on their side, but they were about to learn what mountain justice looked like when you threatened the people Caleb Brandt had chosen to protect. Winter was coming, and with it a reckoning that would test everything they'd both come to believe about courage, love, and the price of freedom. The first snowfall came 2 weeks later, dusting the valley in pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Ruth Anne stood at the kitchen window watching Caleb split wood for the winter, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The peaceful scene belied the tension that had settled over them since Morrison's visit. They both knew the railroad men would return. It was just a matter of when. "Storm coming," Caleb said, as he stomped the snow off his boots and entered the kitchen. "Big one by the look of those clouds. We might be snowed in for days." Ruth Anne ladled hot coffee into his cup, her movements automatic after weeks of sharing domestic routines. "Good. Maybe it'll keep unwanted visitors away." But even as she spoke, she heard the sound that had haunted her dreams, hoofbeats on the mountain trail. Multiple riders, this time more than before. Caleb's hand went immediately to his rifle. "Get upstairs," he ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Stay away from the windows." But Ruth Anne was already moving toward the front door. "No, I'm tired of hiding. If they want me, they can face me." "Ruth Anne, don't be foolish." "I'm not being foolish," she said, turning to face him, with eyes that blazed with determination. "I'm being brave. There's a difference." Before he could stop her, she stepped onto the porch. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. 8 men this time, led by Sheriff Briggs himself. Behind him rode Morrison and Uncle Josiah, along with 5 hard-looking men who wore their guns like some men wore jewelry, openly and with pride. "Ruth Anne Stoultz." Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice carrying the false authority of a man trying to convince himself he was doing right. "By order of the territorial court, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the Colorado Central Railroad." "That's a lie, and you know it," Ruth Anne called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've committed no crime except refusing to be robbed." Morrison urged his horse forward, a smug smile playing about his lips. "Miss Stoultz, we've discovered some very interesting discrepancies in your father's land claim. It seems the original deed was never properly filed, which means the land technically belongs to the territory. The railroad has filed a legitimate claim, and you've been illegally squatting." "More lies," Caleb said from behind her, his rifle held ready. "That land was bought and paid for 10 years ago. I've seen the papers myself." "Have you seen this paper?" Morrison produced a document from his coat with a flourish. "A warrant for Miss Stoultz's arrest, signed by Judge Mackenzie himself. She's to be taken into custody immediately and held for trial." Ruth Anne felt the world spin around her. Judge Mackenzie was known to be in the railroad's pocket, but his signature on a warrant would be recognized by any court in the territory. They'd found a way to make their theft legal. "You have no jurisdiction here," Caleb said, stepping beside Ruth Anne. "This valley's in Shoshone territory, protected by federal treaty." Sheriff Briggs laughed a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Treaties can be reinterpreted, especially when there's concerns about fugitives hiding among the savages." The casual slur made Caleb's jaw tighten, but he kept his rifle steady. "You'll have to go through me to take her." "That can be arranged," said one of the gunmen, a scarred man with dead eyes who looked like he'd killed before and would again without losing sleep. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Ruth Anne could feel violence hovering in the air like smoke waiting for the smallest spark to explode into flame. In that moment, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. "Ruth Anne, no." Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. "I won't have blood spilled on my account," she said, not taking her eyes off the sheriff. "If they want me, they can have me. But I want to see this warrant, and I want to know exactly what I'm being charged with." Morrison's smile widened. "How reasonable of you. You'll find everything is perfectly legal and above board." But as Sheriff Briggs dismounted and approached the porch, Ruth Anne saw something in his eyes that chilled her more than the mountain wind. This wasn't just about legal procedures or even the railroad's greed. There was something personal here, something ugly and vindictive. "You caused me a lot of embarrassment in town, girl," he said in a voice low enough that only she and Caleb could hear. "Made me look like a fool in front of important men. Time to pay for that." Ruth Anne's blood turned to ice. She suddenly understood that this wasn't going to end with a trial or even a hanging. Men like Briggs didn't forgive public humiliation, and powerful men like Morrison didn't leave loose ends. "Caleb," she whispered, "they're not planning to take me to jail." She saw understanding dawn, and then his winter blue eyes saw his grip tighten on his rifle. But before he could act, Uncle Josiah called out from horseback, "Oh, I almost forgot. Brandt, you might be interested to know that your Indian friends won't be coming to help you. Seems there was a little accident at their winter camp last night." Caleb went rigid as a board. "What are you talking about?" "Fire," Josiah said with mock sorrow. "Terrible thing. Started in the middle of the night, spread so fast nobody could escape. Chief Running Elk, his wife, their children, all of them gone. Such a tragedy." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. Ruth Anne saw the color drain from his face, saw his hands begin to shake. The Shoshone had been his family for 5 years, the only people who'd accepted him after Sarah's death. And now they were gone. "You bastards," he whispered, and Ruth Anne had never heard such pain in a human voice. "You murdering bastards." Now, Morrison said with false sympathy. "Accidents happen, especially to people who harbor fugitives and interfere with legitimate business." It was too much. The careful control Caleb had maintained snapped like an overstretched rope. With a roar of rage that echoed off the mountain walls, he brought his rifle up and fired. The bullet took Morrison square in the chest, spinning him from his saddle like a broken doll. Before the echo died, Caleb was working the lever action, swinging toward Sheriff Briggs. "Ruth Anne, run!" he shouted. As chaos erupted in the clearing, the gunmen were drawing their weapons, horses were rearing and screaming, and Ruth Anne stood frozen in the center of it all. She watched Caleb fire again, saw Sheriff Briggs clutch his shoulder, and tumble backward off the porch. Another shot rang out and splinters exploded from the cabin wall inches from her head. "Get inside!" Caleb grabbed her arm and hauled her bodily through the door as bullets began to fly in earnest. The front windows exploded inward as the gunmen opened fire, filling the air with flying glass and lead. Caleb kicked over the kitchen table and dragged Ruth Anne behind it, then peered over the top to return fire. "How many bullets do you have?" Ruth Anne asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded, despite the terror coursing through her veins. Not enough, Caleb admitted grimly. Maybe 20 rounds total. They've got us outgunned. Another volley shattered what remained of the front windows. Ruth Anne could hear the gunmen shouting to each other, coordinating their attack. They were spreading out, surrounding the cabin. "There's a back door," Caleb said. "If you can make it to the barn, take Luna and ride for the Shoshone camp. Maybe some of them escaped." "I'm not leaving you," Ruth Anne said firmly. "Damn it, woman, this isn't the time for heroics." "You're right," she said, and the steel in her voice made him look at her in surprise. "It's time for something else entirely." Before he could ask what she meant, Ruth Anne was moving. She crawled to the fireplace where Caleb kept his spare ammunition, stuffing cartridges into her pockets. Then she grabbed the pistol she'd seen him cleaning the week before. "Do you even know how to use that?" Caleb demanded. "Point the dangerous end at the bad men and pull the trigger," she replied. "How hard can it be?" Despite everything, he almost smiled. Sarah would have said the same thing. Then maybe Sarah and I would have been friends. Another crash as something heavy hit the front door. The gunmen were getting bolder, closing in for the kill. "Brandt," came a shout from outside. "You killed Mr. Morrison. That's a hanging offense even in this godless territory." "Morrison was a thief and a murderer," Caleb shouted back. "Same as the rest of you." "Maybe so, but he was our thief and murderer. Come out now and we'll make it quick. Stay in there and we'll burn you out like we did them Indians." Ruth Anne saw Caleb's face go white with fresh rage. The mention of the Shoshone's fate hit him like a physical blow, and she knew he was on the verge of doing something desperately foolish. "Caleb," she said quietly, "I need you to listen to me. Really listen." He turned to her, his eyes wild with grief and fury. "They're going to kill us both no matter what we do," she continued. "We both know that. But we can choose how we die. We can go out fighting, or we can give them what they really want." "What are you talking about?" Ruth Anne pulled her father's Bible from her dress pocket. She'd carried it every day since leaving Millfield. "They want my land. They want me dead. But most of all, they want to break my spirit. They want me to sign those papers and betray everything my family stood for. So maybe it's time to show them what real faith looks like." Before Caleb could stop her, Ruth Anne stood up and walked to the shattered front door. Bullets immediately began flying, but she didn't flinch or take cover. She simply stood there, her father's Bible held against her chest, and began to speak. "The Lord is my shepherd." Her voice rang out clear and strong over the gunfire. "I shall not want." The shooting faltered as the gunman realized what she was doing. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." "What the hell is she doing?" one of the gunmen shouted. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Uncle Josiah's voice cracked like a whip. Shut her up now." But Ruth Anne kept going, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." A bullet shattered the doorframe beside her head, but she didn't even flinch. "For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." She's lost her mind. Sheriff Briggs gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "The girl's gone completely mad." "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies," Ruth Anne continued, and now her voice carried to every corner of the valley. "Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over." Caleb stood behind her, his rifle forgotten, staring at this woman who had transformed before his eyes from a frightened girl into something fierce and unbreakable. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." Ruth Anne's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the mountain walls. "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The shooting had stopped completely. Even hardened killers seemed reluctant to gun down a woman reciting scripture. In the silence that followed, Ruth Anne's voice dropped to a conversational tone. "My father taught me that psalm when I was 6 years old." she said to the men outside. He said it was for times when the world seemed too dark to bear, when evil men tried to steal what belonged to God. You're all crazy, Uncle Josiah screamed. Kill her, kill them both. But none of the gunmen moved. Something in Ruth Anne's presence, in her absolute fearlessness, had shaken them more than bullets could have. You want my land, she continued. You want my signature on your papers. You want me to betray my father's memory and my own soul for your railroad money. She stepped fully out onto the porch, still holding her Bible, still showing no fear despite the rifles pointed at her. But I have something to tell you, Mr. Briggs, Uncle Josiah, all of you who serve mammon instead of justice. Her voice grew cold as mountain ice. You can take my land, you can take my life, but you cannot take my soul. That belongs to God, and no earthly power can touch it. Sheriff Briggs struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage despite his wounded shoulder. Enough of this religious nonsense, boys. Burn the cabin. We'll roast them like chestnuts. But as the gunmen moved to obey, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the valley entrance. Not the scattered rhythm of a few horses, but the thunder of many riders moving fast. Ruth Anne looked up and felt her heart leap. Coming down the mountain trail like an army was a group of Shoshone warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the pale sunlight. At their head rode a man Ruth Anne had never seen, but somehow recognized Chief Running Elk, very much alive despite Uncle Josiah's lies. Behind him rode perhaps 20 warriors, their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of vengeance against the rocky ground. Impossible, Uncle Josiah breathed. They're all supposed to be dead. Chief Running Elk brought his horse to a halt at the edge of the clearing and surveyed the scene with eyes like black flint. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of mountains and sky. Caleb Brandt is under the protection of the Shoshone Nation, he said in perfect English. Any who harm him or his woman will answer to us. Sheriff Briggs tried to bluster. This is white man's law. You got no jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction ended when you murdered our women and children. Running Elk cut him off, his voice deadly quiet. 3 of our people died in that fire you set. By Shoshone law, that makes you all dead men. The gunmen were looking around nervously now, realizing they were vastly outnumbered by warriors who knew these mountains like their own heartbeats. Wait, Ruth Anne called out, stepping to the edge of the porch. Chief Running Elk, I'm grateful for your protection, but I don't want more blood spilled on my account. The chief turned his hawk-sharp gaze to her. You are the woman Caleb Brandt chose to protect. I am. Then you are under our protection as well. But these men killed our children. Justice must be served. Ruth Anne felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Whatever she said next would determine whether this valley became a battlefield or something else entirely. Chief, she said carefully, my father always taught me that justice and vengeance are different things. These men have done terrible wrongs, but more killing won't bring back your people any more than it would bring back mine. Running Elk's expression was unreadable. What would you have us do? Let them ride away to kill again. Ruth Anne looked at the terrified faces of the gunmen, at Uncle Josiah's pale features, at Sheriff Briggs, clutching his wounded shoulder. Then she looked at Caleb standing behind her, with grief and rage warring in his eyes. I would have you bear witness, she said finally. I want everyone to see what happens when greed tries to destroy faith. I want them to remember this day. She turned back to face the gunmen and raised her voice so it carried to every ear in the valley. You came here to steal my land and murder me for refusing to sign your papers. You burned innocent people alive because they dared to help me. You threatened the man who saved my life because he wouldn't stand by and watch injustice triumph. Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying a power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. But you failed. Your railroad money couldn't buy my soul. Your guns couldn't break my spirit. Your lies couldn't corrupt my faith. I stand here free, and you stand there defeated by nothing more than a fat girl with a Bible. Uncle Josiah snarled and lunged toward her, but Chief Running Elk's horse blocked his path with casual ease. "The woman speaks truth," the chief said. "You have been defeated by courage and faith. There is no shame greater than this among any people." "This isn't over," Sheriff Briggs gasped. "The railroad will send more men. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Ruth Anne smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even the hardened gunman step back. "Let them come," she said simply. "This valley is protected by something stronger than guns or money or corrupt laws. It's protected by people who understand that some things are worth more than life itself." She gestured to the Shoshone warriors, to Caleb standing faithful beside her, to the mountains rising all around them like ancient guardians. "You tell your railroad masters that Ruth Anne Stoultz is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And if they want this land, they'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands." The words rang with such finality that even Uncle Josiah seemed to shrink before them. Chief Running Elk nodded approvingly. "The woman has spoken. Now I speak for the Shoshone. This valley is sacred to my people. It is a place of healing where broken spirits come to find peace. We will not allow it to be defiled by men who worship only gold." He fixed the sheriff with a stare that could have melted steel. "You will leave now, all of you, and you will never return. If any railroad men set foot in this valley again, we will consider it an act of war." "You can't threaten us," one of the gunmen protested. "We got rights." "You had rights," Running Elk corrected. "You forfeited them when you chose murder over justice. Now you have only our mercy, and that is running thin." The truth of their situation finally seemed to sink in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by warriors who had every reason to want them dead. Whatever bravado they'd shown earlier evaporated like morning mist. Sheriff Briggs struggled onto his horse, his face gray with pain and defeat. "This ain't legal," he mumbled. "None of this is legal." "Neither was selling a human being like livestock," Ruth Anne replied. "Neither was burning children alive. Neither was planning to murder me to steal my land. I'd say we're about even on the legal front." One by one, the surviving gunmen mounted their horses and prepared to leave. Uncle Josiah was the last to go, his face twisted with impotent rage. "You think you've won something here?" he spat. "You're nothing but a fat, worthless girl hiding behind savages and a crazy mountain man. The railroad always gets what it wants, one way or another." Ruth Anne looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Uncle Josiah, I used to think I was worthless too. Used to believe all the things you and people like you told me about my place in the world. But today I learned something important." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I learned that worth isn't measured by what other people think of you. It's measured by what you're willing to stand up for when everything is on the line. And I'll tell you what I'm worth. I'm worth more than all your railroad money put together." Uncle Josiah opened his mouth to reply, but Chief Running Elk's horse moved between them with deliberate menace. "The woman has spoken," the chief said quietly. "You have heard her words. Now go before my warriors decide that mercy is a luxury we cannot afford." With a final curse, Uncle Josiah spurred his horse and galloped out of the valley, followed by the remaining gunmen and the wounded sheriff. Within minutes, they had disappeared up the mountain trail, leaving nothing behind but the memory of evil men defeated by courage and faith. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, Ruth Anne felt her legs give out. She sank to her knees on the porch, her father's Bible still clutched against her chest, and began to shake as the full weight of what had just happened hit her. Caleb was beside her instantly, his strong arms gathering her close. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "You did it. You sent them running with nothing but words and faith." Chief Running Elk dismounted and approached the porch, his weathered face thoughtful. "The woman speaks with great power," he said to Caleb. "Sarah would have liked her very much." At the mention of his dead wife's name, Caleb's arms tightened around Ruth Anne. "Yes," he said simply. "She would have." The chief studied them both for a long moment. The railroad will not give up easily. They will send others. Then we'll face them too, Ruth Anne said, lifting her head from Caleb's shoulder. This valley is our home now, all of ours, and home is worth fighting for. Running Elk smiled for the first time since arriving, and the expression transformed his stern features. You speak like one of the people now, like someone who understands that the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. He gestured to his warriors who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. We will post guards on the mountain passes. If more railroad men come, we will know of it long before they reach this place. Thank you, Ruth Anne said, and meant it with all her heart. But I can't ask you to risk your lives for my problems. You do not ask, Running Elk replied. We choose, just as you chose to stand against evil when it would have been easier to surrender. That kind of courage creates bonds stronger than blood. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Shoshone warriors made camp at the mouth of the valley. The sound of their voices and the smoke from their fires was a comfort Ruth Anne had never expected to feel. Inside the cabin, she and Caleb worked together to clean up the damage from the gunfight. Most of the windows would need to be replaced, and there were bullet holes in the walls that would require patching, but the structure was sound. I'm sorry about Morrison, Ruth Anne said as they swept up broken glass. I know you didn't want to kill him. Caleb paused in his work, his face shadowed with old pain. I've killed men before, Ruth Anne. In the war, fighting Indians who were protecting their homes, just like we protected ours today. But I never wanted to be a killer again. You're not a killer, she said firmly. You're a protector. There's a difference. Is there? Sometimes I wonder. Ruth Anne set down her broom and turned to face him fully. Caleb Brandt, you saved my life. You've given me a home, shown me kindness when the whole world turned its back on me. You've helped me find courage I never knew I had. If that makes you a killer, then I'm proud to stand beside one. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his winter blue eyes. The grief was still there, the pain of losses that would never fully heal. But there was something else now, hope perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. Sarah used to say that the spirits would send us the right person when we needed them most, he said quietly. I never believed her, thought it was just Indian superstition, but standing on that porch today, watching you face down 8 armed men with nothing but faith and courage, I think maybe she was right. Ruth Anne felt her cheeks warm. I don't know about spirits or destiny. I just knew I couldn't let them win, couldn't let them make me into the worthless creature they said I was. You were never worthless, Caleb said, and the conviction in his voice made her breath catch. From the moment I saw you on that auction block, I knew you were something special. It just took today for you to see it yourself. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of the winter storm Caleb had predicted. But inside the damaged cabin surrounded by the debris of their battle, Ruth Anne felt warmer than she had in years. The railroad might send more men. Uncle Josiah might find new ways to cause trouble. The territorial government might try to revoke the Shoshone treaties, but none of that mattered now. For the first time in her life, Ruth Anne Stoultz knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. She was a woman who had faced evil and emerged victorious, a woman who had found her voice and used it to speak truth to power. She was someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth loving. And as the first snowflakes began to fall outside the broken windows covering the valley in a blanket of pristine white, she knew that whatever came next, she would meet it standing tall. The fat girl from the auction block was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned that true strength comes not from physical power or worldly possessions, but from an unshakable faith in one's own worth. The transformation was complete, and there would be no going back. The storm that night brought 3 feet of snow and winds that howled like banshees through the mountain passes. Ruth Anne lay awake listening to the Shoshone guards, calling to each other across the valley, their voices a comfort against the darkness. She had never imagined that the sound of warriors protecting her home would feel so much like a lullaby. When morning came, the world had transformed into a crystal palace of white and ice. The snow lay so deep that the fence posts looked like mushrooms, and icicles hung from the cabin eaves like nature's own chandelier. Chief Running Elk appeared at their door before the sun had fully risen, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "The passes are blocked," he reported simply. "Nothing moves in or out of this valley until the spring thaw. We are all prisoners here now, but so would be any who sought to harm you." Ruth Anne poured him coffee from the pot she'd started before dawn, her hands steady despite everything that had happened. "Will your people be comfortable through the winter? We have supplies, blankets. We are mountain people," Running Elk said with quiet pride. "Winter is an old friend to us, but your offer shows a generous heart." Sarah Crow Feather chose her husband's woman well. The casual way he spoke of her as Caleb's woman sent heat flooding through Ruth Ann's cheeks. She glanced at Caleb, who was carefully studying his coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. We're not, she began, then stopped. What were they, exactly? She lived in his house, cooked his meals, mended his clothes. They shared conversations by the fire and comfortable silences over breakfast. But they'd never spoken of feelings, never defined what existed between them beyond gratitude and mutual protection. "Time has a way of revealing what the heart already knows," Running Elk said, gently, reading her confusion with eyes that had seen too much of life to be fooled by pretense. "Sarah used to say that the spirits never bring two souls together without purpose." After the chief left to check on his men, an awkward silence settled over the cabin like dust. Ruth Anne busied herself with breakfast preparations while Caleb pretended to read a book he'd already finished twice. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "Caleb, what did he mean about Sarah choosing me? I never met your wife." Caleb set down his book and stared into the fire for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant with memory. "The night before she died, Sarah was delirious with fever. She kept talking about a woman who would come from the east, a woman with corn silk hair and eyes like summer sky. Said this woman would be broken but brave, and that I would know her by her courage." He looked at Ruth Anne with an expression she couldn't read. "She made me promise to protect this woman when she came to help her find her strength." Ruth Anne felt the world tilt around her. "You think I'm the woman from her vision? I think Sarah saw something I was too blind to understand at the time." Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "When I saw you on that auction block, something inside me recognized you. Not your face, but your spirit. The way you held your head up despite their cruelty, the dignity you carried even in that moment of humiliation. It was exactly what Sarah described." The revelation left Ruth Anne speechless. To think that a dying woman had seen her in a vision, had known she would come, had made her husband promise to help her, it was beyond anything she could have imagined. "But I'm not brave," she protested. "Yesterday was the first time I ever stood up to anyone in my life." "Yesterday was the first time you had reason to believe you were worth standing up for," Caleb corrected. "Sarah always said courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. You've always had that courage, Ruth Anne. You just needed to find it." Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see two of the Shoshone warriors dragging someone through the snow toward the cabin. As they got closer, Ruth Anne gasped in recognition. It was Tom Briggs, the sheriff's worthless son, half frozen and barely conscious. The warriors deposited him on the porch like a sack of grain and stepped back, their hands resting meaningfully on their weapons. "Found him hiding in the rocks above the valley," one of them reported to Caleb. "Been there all night by the look of him. Probably would have frozen to death if we hadn't found him." Caleb opened the door and looked down at the shivering young man with disgust. Tom couldn't have been more than 20, with the soft features of someone who'd never known real hardship. His expensive clothes were soaked through, and his lips were blue with cold. "Please," Tom gasped through chattering teeth. "Don't let them kill me. I ain't done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Ruth Anne stepped onto the porch, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Your father tried to have me murdered yesterday. You were part of that mob." "I wasn't," Tom protested weakly. "I mean, yes, I was there, but I didn't want to hurt nobody. Pa made me come along, said it was family business." Caleb grabbed the young man by his coat and hauled him to his feet. "If you're here to spy for your father or the railroad, I'll throw you off this mountain myself." "No, I swear I ain't spying for nobody." Tom's voice cracked with terror and exhaustion. "I ran away from them yesterday after you shot Mr. Morrison. Couldn't stomach what they were planning to do to the lady here." Ruth Anne studied his face, looking for signs of deception. What she saw instead was a frightened young man who looked like he'd been crying. "What were they planning?" she asked quietly. Tom's face crumpled. "After they got you to sign the papers, Pa was gonna make sure you couldn't tell nobody about how they forced you. Said dead witnesses can't testify in court." The casual admission of planned murder hung in the air like smoke. Ruth Anne felt sick to her stomach thinking about how close she'd come to that fate. "Why should we believe you?" Caleb demanded. "For all we know, this is just another railroad trick." "Because I got something you need to know," Tom burst out desperately, "about what they're really planning. It ain't just about your land, miss. There's something else, something bigger." Ruth Anne exchanged glances with Caleb. Whatever Tom knew, they needed to hear it. "Get him inside before he freezes," she said finally. "But watch him close." They settled Tom by the fire with hot coffee and dry clothes. As warmth returned to his body, the full story began to spill out of him like water from a broken dam. "The railroad don't just want your land for the tracks," he said between sips of coffee. "There's silver in these mountains, lots of it. They found a vein that runs right through your valley and up into Shoshone territory." Ruth Anne felt her blood turn cold. Silver changed everything. Men would kill entire towns for a fraction of the wealth a major silver strike represented. "How do you know this?" Caleb asked suspiciously. "My pa ain't the smartest man, but he hears things. The railroad men talked in front of him like he was furniture, told him all kinds of things they shouldn't have." Tom's voice grew stronger as he warmed up. "They got maps, assay reports, everything. This valley's sitting on top of a fortune." "Maps?" Ruth Anne leaned forward. "What kind of maps?" "Geological surveys, mining claims, even plans for a whole mining operation. They've been planning this for months, maybe years. The railroad was just the first step. Once they controlled the land, they could start pulling silver out of the ground." Caleb stood and began pacing, his mind clearly racing. That explains why they were so determined to get Ruth Anne to sign. If she owns the land legally, she owns the mineral rights too. "Not just the land," Tom continued. "The treaty with the Shoshone gives them mineral rights to their territory too. The railroad's been trying to figure out how to break that treaty, or at least get around it." Chief Running Elk, who had been listening silently from the doorway, stepped into the room. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with ancient fury. "They would steal the sacred places of my people for silver," he said in a voice like winter thunder. "The graves of our ancestors, the hunting grounds of our children." "It gets worse," Tom said, shrinking back from the chief's intensity. "They got a plan to blame Indian raids for accidents that might happen to anyone who won't cooperate. Make it look like your people are on the warpath, give the army an excuse to come in and relocate the whole tribe." The room fell into stunned silence. The scope of the railroad's plan was breathtaking in its cruelty and ambition. They weren't just trying to steal land, they were planning genocide. "How many people know about this?" Ruth Anne asked quietly. "Not many. Mr. Morrison, some of the big bosses back east, a few government men in Denver. Oh, and Judge Mackenzie, he's been taking railroad money for years." "And now he's dead," Caleb said grimly. Morrison, which makes this information even more dangerous. Tom nodded miserably. They'll be looking for me by now. Pa probably thinks I ran off to warn you, which I guess I did. They'll kill me if they catch me. Ruth Anne looked at this frightened young man who'd risked everything to bring them vital information. He was weak and spoiled, but he'd found enough courage to do the right thing when it mattered. You can stay here, she said finally, but you'll earn your keep and you'll follow our rules. And if you betray us, I won't, Tom said quickly. I swear on my mother's grave I won't. I'm done with Pa and his schemes, done with all of it. Over the following days, Tom proved surprisingly useful. He knew the railroad's methods, their contacts in the territorial government, and most importantly, their timeline. According to him, they planned to move in force come spring, using a combination of legal challenges, bought judges, and manufactured Indian troubles to seize control of the entire region. We need to get word to the territorial governor, Ruth Anne said one evening as they planned their response. If we can expose the railroad's corruption before spring, the territorial governor's in their pocket too, Tom interrupted. Maybe not completely, but enough. They got dirt on everybody who matters in Denver. Then we go over his head, Caleb said grimly. Federal government, army, somebody has to care about a plot to steal treaty land and commit mass murder. Chief Running Elk, who had taken to joining their evening strategy sessions, shook his head. The white man's government cares nothing for treaties when there is gold or silver to be found. How many promises have been broken when the earth revealed its treasures? It was a sobering truth. Ruth Anne had grown up hearing stories of Indian wars, of treaties made and broken, of tribes relocated or destroyed when valuable resources were discovered on their lands. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Then we fight, she said simply. All of us together. We make it too expensive for them to continue. Fight how? Tom asked. They got money guns, the law. They have those things. Ruth Anne agreed. But we have something more powerful. We have the truth, and we have each other. As winter deepened, their unlikely alliance grew stronger. Tom, initially viewed with suspicion by the Shoshone warriors, gradually earned their grudging respect through hard work and genuine remorse for his family's actions. He proved surprisingly handy with repairs, helping to fix the cabin's damaged windows and patch the bullet holes in the walls. More importantly, he provided a steady stream of intelligence about the railroad's operations. His father, apparently desperate to find his missing son, had been writing letters begging Tom to come home. These letters, delivered by Shoshone scouts who intercepted them on the mountain trails, revealed growing panic among the railroad's local allies. They're scared, Tom reported after reading his father's latest missive. Morrison's death has them all spooked. They don't know what you might know, what evidence you might have. Pa says some of the big bosses are talking about pulling out entirely. Good, Ruth Anne said with satisfaction. Let them be scared, let them wonder what we're planning. But she knew their respite was temporary. Come spring, when the mountain passes reopened, the railroad would return in force. They might bring federal marshals this time, or even army troops. The legal fiction that had protected the valley through winter would crumble under sufficient pressure and money. It was during one of these dark moments of contemplation that Caleb found her on the porch, staring out at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded their sanctuary. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, settling beside her on the wooden bench he'd built weeks earlier. "I was thinking about my parents," Ruth Anne admitted. "They worked so hard for that little farm, sacrificed so much, and for what so men like Morrison could steal it with legal tricks and bribery. Your parents didn't work for the railroad's profit," Caleb said gently. "They worked for you, for the future they wanted you to have. That can't be stolen no matter what papers get signed." Ruth Anne leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Over the months since leaving Millfield, Caleb had become more than her protector. He'd become her anchor, the steady point around which her new life revolved. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day, she said quietly. Someone else would have helped you, Caleb replied without hesitation. Maybe not the same way, but someone would have stepped forward. Good people recognize each other, Ruth Anne. They find each other when it matters most. Or do you really believe that? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I have to believe it. Otherwise Sarah's death meant nothing. Otherwise all the suffering in the world is just random cruelty. His voice carried the weight of old grief, but also something else, a hard-won wisdom born from loss and healing. I used to think the world was fundamentally broken, he continued, that evil always won in the end because good people were too weak or too scared to fight back. But watching you these past months, seeing your courage grow stronger every day, it's changed something in me. Ruth Anne turned to look at him, seeing her own reflection in his winter blue eyes. What's changed? I'm not afraid anymore, he said simply. Not of the railroad, not of the future, not of anything, because I've seen what real courage looks like, and I know that as long as people like you exist, evil can never truly win. The words hung between them like a bridge connecting their hearts across the space that grief and fear had carved between them. Ruth Anne felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Caleb, she began, then stopped. How did you tell a man that he'd saved more than your life? How did you explain that he'd saved your soul, your sense of worth, your ability to hope for tomorrow? I know, he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. I feel it too. Before she could lose her nerve, Ruth Anne reached up and cupped his face with her hand. His skin was rough with cold and old scars, but his eyes were infinitely gentle as they searched her face. Sarah told you to protect me, she whispered, Darman, but you've done so much more than that. You've helped me become someone worth protecting. Caleb's hand covered hers, his thumb brushing across her knuckles with careful tenderness. You were always worth protecting, Ruth Anne. I just helped you see it. When he kissed her, it was with the gentle reverence of a man who had learned the true value of love through loss. Ruth Anne felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of completion, of coming home to a place she'd never known existed. When they finally broke apart, the world seemed different somehow, brighter, more full of possibility despite the challenges that lay ahead. What happens now? Ruth Anne asked, though she wasn't sure if she meant now as in this moment or now as in the spring when their enemies would return. Now we face whatever comes together, Caleb said firmly, as partners, as equals, as whatever we choose to be. The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn. Chief Running Elk was climbing the porch steps, his weathered face thoughtful. Forgive the interruption, he said with a slight smile, but my scouts have returned from the eastern passes. They bring news. Ruth Anne felt her stomach clench with fear, but Caleb squeezed her hand reassuringly. What kind of news? He asked. The kind that changes everything, Running Elk replied. It seems the territorial government has received some very interesting documents. Letters, financial records, detailed plans for illegal mining operations on treaty land. Someone has been very busy exposing the railroad's corruption. Ruth Anne blinked in confusion. But we haven't sent anything to the government. How could they have? Tom's father, Running Elk said, with evident satisfaction. In his desperation to find his son, Sheriff Briggs has been writing increasingly detailed letters about the railroad's plans. Letters that my warriors have been intercepting and forwarding to certain honest officials in Denver. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock. Pa's been spilling everything, all of it. Everything, the chief confirmed. Names, dates, amounts of money exchanged, even details about the planned attacks on my people. Your father's desperation to save his own skin has provided us with all the evidence we need. The irony was breathtaking. Sheriff Briggs, in trying to convince his son to return, had inadvertently exposed the entire conspiracy. His letters meant to show Tom how dangerous it was to oppose the railroad had instead provided a complete roadmap of their illegal activities. "What does this mean?" Ruth Anne asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means the federal government is very interested in speaking with certain railroad executives," Running Elk replied. "It means judges who have been taking bribes are about to find themselves in very uncomfortable positions. And it means the treaty protecting Shoshone land is about to be enforced by people who actually respect the law." Tom let out a shaky laugh. "Pa always said I was the stupid one in the family." Turns out he was talking about himself. As the full implications sank in, Ruth Anne felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine, unqualified hope. The railroad's local conspiracy was unraveling. Their bought officials were being exposed, and their plans for spring were crumbling before they could be implemented. "But it's not over yet," Caleb warned, ever practical. "Desperate men do desperate things. They might try one last assault before the federal authorities shut them down completely." "Let them come," Ruth Anne said, and was surprised by the steel in her own voice. "We've faced their worst and survived. We've found our strength, our purpose, our home. Whatever they bring next, we'll meet it together." Chief Running Elk nodded approvingly. "Sarah Crow Feather chose well. Her husband's new woman has the heart of a warrior." As if summoned by the mention of his dead wife's name, a wind swept down from the mountains carrying the scent of pine and snow and something else, something that might have been blessing or promise, or simply the acknowledgement that some bonds transcend death itself. Ruth Anne looked around at the faces of her chosen family: Caleb with his quiet strength, Tom with his newfound courage, Chief Running Elk with his ancient wisdom, and the Shoshone warriors who had adopted her cause as their own. 6 months ago she had been a nobody, a burden a woman sold for $1 to clear a debt. Now she was the center of a circle of loyalty and love that even the railroad's money couldn't break. The transformation wasn't complete yet. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face, more opportunities to prove that courage and faith could triumph over greed and corruption. But sitting on her porch in the mountain sanctuary she now called home, surrounded by people who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, Ruth Anne Stoultz knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The fat girl from the auction block was truly gone forever. In her place sat a woman who had learned that true wealth couldn't be measured in silver or gold, but in the bonds of loyalty freely given and gratefully received. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it, standing tall. Spring came to the valley like a whispered promise, bringing with it the sound of melting snow and the first tentative bird songs of the new season. Ruth Anne stood in the garden she and Caleb had planned together through the long winter nights, her hands deep in the rich earth as she planted seeds that would feed them through the coming year. The simple act of nurturing new life felt like a benediction after months of waiting and watching for enemies who might never come. The federal investigation had moved swiftly once Sheriff Briggs's inadvertent confessions reached the right hands. By March, 3 railroad executives had been arrested in Denver. Judge Mackenzie had fled the territory rather than face corruption charges, and the entire Colorado Central Land Acquisition Program had been suspended pending a complete review. The silver deposits were still there, buried deep in the mountain stone, but they would remain untouched until proper agreements could be negotiated with both Ruth Anne and the Shoshone Nation. "Ironic, isn't it?" Tom said as he helped her clear rocks from the soil. The young man had grown lean and strong over the winter, his soft features carved into something approaching character by months of honest labor and genuine remorse. "Pa thought he was saving me by telling me all their secrets. Instead, he saved you, me, and probably half the territory." Ruth Anne smiled as she watched him work. Tom had proven himself in ways none of them had expected, not just through physical labor, but through his genuine transformation from a spoiled sheriff's son into someone who understood the value of earned respect. The Shoshone warriors, initially suspicious of any Briggs family member, now treated him with the casual acceptance reserved for proven allies. "Your father loved you," she said gently. "He just didn't know how to show it, except through protection and privilege. Sometimes love makes us do foolish things." Like Pa trying to buy his way into the railroad's good graces, Tom agreed ruefully. Or me going along with things I knew were wrong because I was too scared to stand up to him. Caleb emerged from the cabin carrying a steaming mug of coffee and the morning's mail delivered by a Shoshone scout who made weekly runs to the territorial postal office. His movements had lost some of their rigid alertness over the past months, though Ruth Anne knew he would never be completely at ease. Men who had lived through what Caleb had survived never fully lowered their guard. "Letter from the territorial governor," he announced, settling beside Ruth Anne on the garden bench he'd built to replace the one damaged in the October gunfight. "And another one from someone called Martha Whitehorse at the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Ruth Anne wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the letters with curious anticipation. Official correspondence had become a regular part of their lives since the federal investigation began, but she'd learned to read the subtle differences between routine bureaucracy and genuinely important news. The governor's letter was brief and to the point. The territorial government officially recognized Ruth Anne's legal ownership of the Stoultz family land with all mineral rights intact. More importantly, the federal treaty with the Shoshone Nation had been reaffirmed and strengthened with additional protections against future attempts at illegal seizure. The railroad's claims were declared null and void, and several officials who had accepted bribes were facing federal prosecution. "Well," Ruth Anne said, setting down the first letter with a satisfied smile, "I suppose that makes it official. The valley is ours, free and clear." "What about the other letter?" Tom asked, looking up from his weeding with dirt-stained hands and genuine curiosity. The Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence proved even more interesting. Martha Whitehorse, it turned out, was a Cherokee lawyer who had been assigned to review the railroad case and ensure proper compliance with federal treaty obligations. But her letter contained more than just legal verification. It included a proposal that took Ruth Anne's breath away. "She wants to establish a school here." Ruth Anne read aloud, her voice growing stronger with excitement. "A special school for Indian children from various tribes, but also open to any child in the territory, regardless of background. She says the valley's isolation would protect students from the negative influences of towns where prejudice runs high." Caleb leaned forward, his winter blue eyes lighting with interest. "A school here, more than just a school." Ruth Anne continued reading. "A place where children could learn both traditional skills and modern education, where Indian children could study their own languages and customs alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic, where all children could learn to respect each other regardless of race or background." Chief Running Elk, who had approached silently as was his habit, listened with growing approval. "This woman understands something many white educators do not. Knowledge that destroys one's heritage in the gaining is no knowledge at all." The Bureau would provide funding for buildings, supplies, and teacher salaries, Ruth Anne continued. "They're looking for someone to oversee the project, someone who understands both the challenges and the potential of bringing different communities together." Tom looked up with a grin that transformed his face. "Sounds like they're looking for someone exactly like you, Miss Ruth Anne." The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and full of possibility. Ruth Anne tried to imagine children's voices echoing through the fool the valley saw in her mind's eye, a proper schoolhouse rising beside the cabin, pictured young faces of various colors bent over books and slates while learning to see each other as simply human. "It would be a lot of work," Caleb said carefully, though she could hear the underlying excitement in his voice. "Building new structures, recruiting teachers, managing students from different tribes and backgrounds. Good work, though." Ruth Anne replied, her heart already racing with the possibilities. Important work, the kind of work that builds bridges instead of walls. Chief Running Elk nodded thoughtfully. Our children need education to survive in the white man's world, but they also need to remember who they are, where they come from. A school that honors both would be a great gift. Over the following weeks, as spring blossomed into early summer, the valley became a hive of planning and preparation. Martha Whitehorse arrived in May, a dignified woman in her 40s, whose Cherokee features and Harvard education commanded immediate respect from both the Shoshone warriors and territorial officials. She proved to be everything her letters had suggested: intelligent, practical, and deeply committed to creating educational opportunities that honored rather than destroyed cultural identity. The children will come from 7 different tribes, she explained during one of their planning sessions: Shoshone, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, Crow, Cherokee, and Navajo. We'll also accept applications from white families who want their children educated alongside Indian students. The goal is integration based on mutual respect rather than forced assimilation. The physical construction began immediately. Shoshone workers, assisted by Tom and several volunteers from nearby settlements, began clearing ground for a proper schoolhouse. Caleb threw himself into the project with the focused intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him, designing buildings that would be both functional and beautiful structures that honored the natural landscape rather than imposing upon it. Ruth Anne found herself appointed as the school's first headmistress, a position that both thrilled and terrified her. She had never taught professionally, had never managed anything more complex than a household, yet something in Martha Whitehorse's confident assessment convinced her she could grow into the role. "You have something most educators lack," Martha told her one evening as they reviewed curriculum plans. "You understand what it feels like to be dismissed, undervalued, treated as less than human. That empathy will serve these children better than any formal training." The first students arrived in August, just as the valley reached the peak of its summer beauty. 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces reflecting the rich diversity of the American West. There was Joseph Running Bear, a Shoshone boy, whose quick wit masked deep anger at seeing his people's way of life threatened. Sarah Walking Cloud, a shy Cheyenne girl, who spoke 3 languages fluently, but had never been allowed to show her intelligence in a white school. David Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants who had faced persecution in the mining camps, and Maria Santos, whose Mexican family had been driven from their land by the same kind of legal trickery the railroad had attempted. Each child carried their own story of displacement, discrimination, or simple lack of opportunity. Each had been failed in some way by a society that judged worth by skin color, language, or family background. Watching them explore the valley with cautious wonder, Ruth Anne felt the full weight of the responsibility she had accepted. "They're so young," she murmured to Caleb as they watched the children set up their dormitory areas in the newly completed residential building. "Young enough to learn different ways of seeing the world," he replied. "Old enough to remember what they learn here for the rest of their lives." The early weeks were challenging in ways Ruth Anne had never anticipated. The children spoke different languages, followed different customs, and carried generations of inherited mistrust toward each other's peoples. Fights broke out over everything from seating arrangements to food preferences. Some of the Indian children resented the presence of white students, while some of the white children struggled with being minorities for the first time in their lives. "This isn't working," Tom said one evening after breaking up the third fight of the day. "Maybe bringing all these different groups together was a mistake." "Maybe," Ruth Anne admitted, feeling the weight of every frustrated tear and angry word. "Or maybe we just need to give them time to see what they have in common instead of what separates them." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chief Running Elk, who had been observing the school's struggles with patient interest, approached Ruth Anne with a proposal. "The children fight because they do not understand each other's stories. he said simply. Perhaps it is time for them to hear those stories. That evening, he gathered all the students around a fire in the valley's central clearing and began to speak, not about academic subjects or behavioral expectations, but about the history of his people, their struggles, their triumphs, their deep connection to the land that surrounded them. His words painted pictures of a world where courage and wisdom mattered more than skin color, where strength was measured in character rather than conquest. When he finished, young Joseph Running Bear surprised everyone by standing and speaking about his own family's story, the grandmother who had survived a cavalry attack, the uncle who had learned to read English in order to protect his people from fraudulent contracts. His words opened a floodgate of sharing as other children began telling their own family histories. Sarah Walking Cloud spoke about her mother's skill as a healer, knowledge passed down through generations of Cheyenne women. David Chen described his father's journey from China, the prejudice he had faced, and the quiet dignity with which he had built a new life in a hostile land. Maria Santos shared stories of her grandfather's ranch, stolen through legal trickery but never forgotten in the family's heart. Even the white children found stories to tell tales of grandparents who had fled poverty in Europe, of families seeking fresh starts in a land that promised opportunity to those brave enough to claim it. As the fire burned lower and the stories continued, Ruth Anne watched something beautiful happen. The children began to see each other not as representatives of enemy tribes or threatening outsiders, but as individuals with their own dreams, fears, and family legacies. "You see," Chief Running Elk said quietly to Ruth Anne as the evening wound down, "when people share their stories, they discover they are not so different after all." From that night forward, storytelling became a central part of the school's curriculum. Children learned mathematics through problems that reflected their diverse backgrounds, studied geography by tracing their families' migrations, and practiced writing by recording the oral histories of their grandparents. Instead of forcing them to abandon their cultural identities, the school celebrated those identities while teaching the skills they would need to navigate a changing world. Martha Whitehorse visited regularly, bringing supplies, new students, and reports on the school's growing reputation. Word of their success had spread throughout the territory and beyond, attracting attention from educators who were beginning to question the wisdom of forced assimilation policies. "You're becoming famous," Martha told Ruth Anne during one of her autumn visits. "The Commissioner of Indian Education wants to visit next spring. There's talk of establishing similar schools in other territories." The idea of fame made Ruth Anne uncomfortable, but the prospect of helping more children like those in her valley filled her with quiet satisfaction. She had found her calling in ways she could never have imagined during those dark days on the auction block. As winter approached again, the school settled into comfortable rhythms. Children attended formal classes in the morning, worked on practical projects in the afternoon, and gathered for stories and cultural activities in the evening. The older students helped teach the younger ones, creating bonds that transcended tribal affiliations. Conflicts still arose, but they were resolved through discussion and mutual understanding rather than fighting. Caleb had taken on the role of practical skills instructor, teaching both boys and girls how to hunt, track, build, and repair. His patient manner and genuine respect for different cultural approaches made him popular with students from all backgrounds. "You're a natural teacher," Ruth Anne told him one evening as they watched him help young David Chen learn to use a bow, while Joseph Running Bear demonstrated traditional arrow-making techniques. "So are you," Caleb replied, his arm tightening around her waist, as they stood on the cabin porch that had become their favorite evening gathering place. "Sarah would be proud of what we've built here." Their relationship had deepened and solidified over the months of working together. They had married quietly in the spring, with Chief Running Elk performing a ceremony that honored both Christian and Shoshone traditions. The union felt as natural as breathing, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and deep, abiding love. Tom had also found his place in their growing community, serving as the school's liaison with territorial officials and helping manage the practical details of housing and feeding students from such diverse backgrounds. His transformation from spoiled sheriff's son to responsible community leader remained one of Ruth Anne's favorite examples of how people could change when given the chance to prove their worth. "You know what I think about sometimes," Tom said one evening as they sat around the fire with several of the older students. "I think about what would have happened if you'd signed those railroad papers back in October, if you'd just given up and let them have what they wanted." Ruth Anne considered the question seriously. If she had surrendered to the railroad's pressure, the valley would now be scarred with mining operations. The Shoshone would have been relocated to some distant reservation. The school would never have existed, and 23 children would still be struggling to find their place in a world that offered them few opportunities. "I think about it too," she admitted. "But then I remember what my father used to tell me, that God has a plan for everyone, even when we can't see it. Maybe especially when we can't see it." Joseph Running Bear, now 15 and one of the school's natural leaders, looked up from the arrow he was fletching. "My grandmother says the spirits bring people together when their purposes align. Maybe you were all meant to find each other." "Maybe we were," Ruth Anne agreed, looking around at the faces, illuminated by firelight faces that represented so many different backgrounds, but had become united in common purpose. As autumn deepened into winter, news arrived that brought their story full circle. Sheriff Briggs had been arrested on federal charges related to his role in the railroad conspiracy. Uncle Josiah had fled the territory entirely, leaving behind debts and warrants that would follow him for the rest of his life. The remaining railroad executives involved in the scheme were facing prison sentences that would effectively end their careers. "Justice," Martha Whitehorse said with satisfaction when she brought the news. It took time, but justice eventually found them all. Ruth Anne felt no particular triumph at her former tormentor's downfall. Too much good had grown from the conflict for her to waste energy on vindictive satisfaction, but she was grateful that their defeat meant other families would be spared similar persecution. The school's second year brought new challenges and new successes. Enrollment grew to 38 students, requiring expansion of the dormitory and classroom buildings. 3 teachers joined the staff, including a young Arapaho woman named Grace Spotted Horse, who had graduated from an Eastern college and returned west to serve her people. More importantly, the school's first graduates were beginning to make their mark in the wider world. Sarah Walking Cloud had been accepted to a teacher training program in Denver, planning to return and establish similar schools on other reservations. David Chen was working with his father to start a business that would employ workers from various ethnic backgrounds. Joseph Running Bear had been selected to attend the Territorial Legislative Assembly as a youth representative, the first Indian ever chosen for such a role. "They're going to change the world," Ruth Anne said to Caleb as they watched Joseph deliver a practice speech to his fellow students, "not by abandoning who they are, but by becoming the best versions of themselves." "Just like someone else I know," Caleb replied with a smile that still made her heart skip after 2 years of marriage. As spring returned to the valley once again, Ruth Anne stood in the same garden where she had planted her first seeds as a refugee from her former life. The space had grown to include beds tended by students from different tribes, each section reflecting the agricultural traditions of various cultures. Corn, beans, and squash grew alongside vegetables from China, Mexico, and Europe, creating a living symbol of the harmony that was possible when diversity was celebrated rather than feared. Children's voices echoed from the schoolhouse, where Grace Spotted Horse was teaching a mathematics lesson in 3 languages. The sound of hammering came from the workshop where Caleb supervised older students in building furniture for the expanding dormitories. Smoke rose from the kitchen where students took turns preparing meals that represented their diverse cultural backgrounds. It was a scene of productive chaos of multiple communities working together toward common goals of differences being transformed into strengths rather than sources of division. Standing in the midst of it all, Ruth Anne marveled at the journey that had brought her to this place. 3 years ago, she had been a broken woman with no future, sold like livestock to clear debts she had never incurred. Today, she was the headmistress of the territory's most innovative school, a respected voice in educational policy, and the center of a community that was proving integration could work when based on mutual respect rather than forced conformity. Chief Running Elk approached through the garden rows, his weathered face thoughtful as always. At 68, he had become the school's unofficial grandfather, sharing wisdom with students and staff alike while serving as a bridge between traditional ways and modern necessities. "The State Education Commissioner arrives tomorrow," he said simply. "He comes to see if our methods should be adopted in other schools throughout the territory." Ruth Anne nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that came with official inspections. So much depended on making a good impression, on demonstrating that their approach produced results that could be measured by conventional standards, as well as the less tangible but equally important growth in character and cultural understanding. "Are you worried?" she asked. Chief Running Elk's smile was serene. "I have lived through cavalry attacks, forced relocations, and the deaths of most of my generation. A government bureaucrat asking questions about teaching methods does not concern me greatly." His calm confidence was infectious. Ruth Anne realized that somewhere along the way she had stopped defining herself by other people's approval. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of disappointing authority figures was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and trusted her own judgment. "You're right," she said, feeling tension leave her shoulders. "We know what we've accomplished here. If he can't see it, that's his limitation, not ours." The commissioner's visit went better than anyone had dared hope. Dr. Benjamin Harrison, a scholarly man with genuine interest in educational innovation, spent 3 days observing classes, interviewing students, and reviewing test scores. What he found exceeded every metric by which schools were traditionally measured. "Remarkable," he said to Ruth Anne on his final evening. "Your students are outperforming their peers in white schools throughout the territory, despite many of them entering with significant educational disadvantages. More importantly, they demonstrate levels of cooperation, leadership, and cultural awareness that I've never seen in any educational institution." The formal recommendation he submitted to the territorial government was unequivocal. The Valley School model should be expanded and replicated throughout the American West. Funding was approved for 3 additional schools, each to be overseen by graduates of Ruth Anne's program. As summer faded into autumn, the valley buzzed with preparations for a celebration that would mark the school's 3rd anniversary. Students, families, and official guests would gather to honor the progress made and the bright futures that lay ahead. The night before the celebration, Ruth Anne walked alone through the quiet valley, retracing the paths that had become so familiar over the years. She paused at the spot where Morrison had fallen, where the final confrontation with the railroad men had taken place. Wildflowers grew there now, their delicate beauty transforming a place of violence into something peaceful and healing. She thought about the woman she had been that terrible day in October, frightened, desperate, clinging to a faith that seemed naive in the face of such overwhelming evil. That woman had found strength she never knew she possessed, had stood against impossible odds, and emerged victorious not through violence, but through an unshakable belief in human dignity and divine justice. Caleb found her there as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, his presence as comforting and reliable as ever. "Tomorrow's going to be quite a day," he said, slipping his arm around her waist. "Yes, it is." Ruth Anne leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had saved her life and then helped her save herself. "Sometimes I can't believe we're really here doing this work, making this difference." "Believe it," Caleb said softly. "You earned every bit of it. From that first moment when you chose courage over surrender, you've been building toward this. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one over the mountain peaks that sheltered their valley. Somewhere in the darkness, nightbirds called to each other across the streams and meadows that had become their home. From the dormitories came the soft sounds of students settling in for sleep, secure in the knowledge that they were valued and loved regardless of their backgrounds. Tomorrow would bring speeches and ceremonies, official recognition, and plans for expansion. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their mountain sanctuary, Ruth Anne Stoultz Brandt simply savored the miracle of belonging to this place, to this community, to this life she had never dared imagine for herself. The fat girl from the auction block was indeed gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned that worth couldn't be purchased or sold, that dignity was a choice rather than a gift, and that love for oneself, for others, for the work that gives life meaning was the most powerful force in the universe. As the mountain wind whispered through the valley that had become her kingdom, Ruth Anne smiled and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where God had always intended her to be. The transformation was complete, the circle closed, the story written in courage and sealed with grace.